Welcome to Studio Malibu. My name is David Levy. I'm with Trusted Confidential Coverage. We have two very passionate people with us today. I'd like to introduce Aidan Doyle. Aidan Doyle is from Albany, New York. He's 21 years old, a philosopher, jazz student, double major at UCLA. He began publishing content relating to the Israeli-Palestine conflict several months ago and continues to do so until today on social media. I'd also like to introduce Michael Berenbaum. Michael is an American scholar, professor, rabbi, and filmmaker who specializes in the study of the Holocaust. He oversaw the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. We're here today to have a peaceful and engaging discussion regarding the Israeli-Palestine conflict. There are a few principles that I hope that we can agree on before embarking on some difficult conversation. A healthy democracy is founded on the principles of compassionate engagement, conversation, open-mindedness, and mutual respect of opposing viewpoints. We're not trying to determine right or wrong. We're just trying to understand the viewpoints here today. Human life is valuable. We aim to avoid suffering for everybody. We're not here to trap. We're here to understand today.
Good.
I'd like to welcome Sid Munjal, who'll be taking my seat to moderate this conversation. Thank you, Sid.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. Michael, Aidan, can you give us a little background as to your involvement with the encampments at UCLA or the University of California, Los Angeles, and some activist groups such as SJP, which is also known as Students for Justice in Palestine?
Sure. I'm not actually associated with SJP, but I was involved in the encampment. I was there every day from Thursday until it was shut down on the next Thursday morning, or May 2nd, and that is essentially the extent of my involvement. I was there on Tuesday as well when it was attacked by counter-protesters, and I was also arrested Thursday morning.
And Michael, can you give us a little background as to your expertise regarding the current conflict in the Middle East, such as Israel and Palestine?
I'm a historian who's specialized in modern Jewish history. I have, academic credentials. I've written and edited 24 books. I edited the Encyclopedia Judaica, and I've written on the Holocaust and on the establishment and the government of Israel for the past many years. I've lived in Israel. I was in Israel as a student. I was in Israel as a professor, and I travel Israel quite frequently.
What is your definition of Zionism, and what does it represent to you? Aidan, if you could start, please.
Sure. Well, as with most words in the political lexicon, it can be interpreted in many different ways. Zionism, as I understand it, is the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the Holy Land, in Palestine. There's other definitions of Zionism, like the establishment of a Jewish homeland in other places, but largely that's not how we understand it today, and that was really abandoned early on in the Zionist movement. Even though there are different ways of interpreting it, the general understanding that most people have today is the establishment of a Jewish homeland, a Jewish majority state in the region that is known now as Israel and Palestine.
I understood. Michael, how would you define Zionism?
Well, let's begin by saying there are multiple forms of Zionism. The most limited there's political Zionism. Political Zionism begins with the notion that Jews are a people, and a people are entitled to self-determination, and that people, the Jewish people, have a root in the land of Israel, which was called at its establishment the land of Palestine, and consequently they moved to reestablish their nationhood, as it were, there. But there are other forms of Zionism. There's religious Zionism, there is political Zionism, there's cultural Zionism, and one of the intriguing things about it is there was debate in the early Zionist movement as to what form it should take, whether political Zionism or cultural Zionism. And the intriguing thing is, as political Zionism has become controversial, cultural Zionism has manifested itself with an incredible, living, vibrant, Hebrew-speaking culture with art, music, literature, science, technology, philosophy, study of Judaism, and a world-class culture
Would you subscribe to both cultural and political Zionism, or would you just subscribe to one?
I clearly subscribe to both, but political Zionism has multiple forms. I'm essentially a subscriber to the idea that Jews and Palestinians have to engage in coexistence in the same land. I'm in favor of a two-state solution, though I don't think at this moment that's within the cards or possible.
Aidan, would you disagree with the idea of like political Zionism as coexistence, as Michael just said, like two-state? Would you be opposed to a two-state solution or no?
Well, some form of two-state solution is pretty much inevitable. It's going to be impossible, especially with such ardent backing from the United States, to achieve what many pro-Palestinian people want, which is a one-state solution with equal rights, especially in America, with equal rights and equal opportunity and no discrimination between peoples for everyone. So in that way, I would be supportive of a two-state solution as long as it adequately addresses the rights and the needs of Palestinian people and Israeli people equally. But I believe a one-state solution is the best solution, making sure that no rights of Jewish people are taken away, and making sure that the occupation in the West Bank and the frequent and periodic incursions into Gaza end, and making sure that the land is unified with as it was before 1948, or excuse me, as it was with Jews, Muslims, and Christians living together peacefully.
I think we should talk about divorce. And divorce means the following. People divorce because they can't get along together. And when they divorce, the best divorce has ground rules. You can't sleep in the same bed. You can't live in the same house. You're best off if you are economically independent one another. And you have to minimize the tensions so that you don't destroy the children.
Gotcha.
In this case, what that would mean essentially is separation of the Palestinians and the Israelis into two national entities that could exist independently of each other, that would have a certain economic independence, and they would have to get along well enough not to despoil the land. Because if you look at, and my brother-in-law was the chief scientist of the Israel Environmental Protection, the equivalent of the Israeli Environmental Protection Agency. And because of the rules of gravity and the nature of the land and the issues of water and everything else, the land itself has to be treated as one entity for the purposes of water supply, sewage, drainage, and the like. And consequently, you ultimately need enough of an agreement between the two parties that they don't despoil the land. But there is no evidence at this moment that peace is possible. There is considerable evidence that the reason that they should separate is because they can't get along together and they can't live with each other. Now, that's different also with one segment that we don't speak about, which is the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who have indicated, who have a double identity. One is as Palestinians and the other is as Israelis, and who have not necessarily indicated that they would like to live in an independent Palestinian state.
And you would say a one-state solution, but just with everybody together?
Yeah, the two-state solution has a few problems, some which are documented in humanitarian law, and some which are simply emotional, things that when we're presented, facts that when we're presented with them, we feel like this is wrong. The legal one is the universal right to return, that especially the people who were actually victims of the Nakba in 1948 have a right to return to their houses, which were confiscated by the Israeli state in 1948. The second is that the idea of 2 million people, 2.1 million people potentially living in a 25-mile strip in the corner of where they once occupied all of is so horrifying to think about, especially when you consider their lack of independence and the lack of economic development, the lack of industrial development that they have not been able to achieve. That a two-state solution, if it were to happen, would have to include such a massive redistribution of land that Israel would need to make concessions that it's not actually ready to make. Now, if you're going to make the case that Israel should make concessions, that they should contribute to the redevelopment of Gaza, that they should give land surrounding Gaza back to the Gazans, well, maybe we can start to have a conversation, but it still doesn't address the universal right of people to return to the lands that they've been forced out from. That was once their home.
Understood, yeah.
Remember, we've been talking about a two-state solution since 1937.
Yes.
1937, the Peel Commission came in, they looked at the situation. Two peoples live on a land, as one says it's mine, the other says it's mine. The solution they came is divided.
Yes.
We had a two-state solution existed, was the proposal of 1948, in which there was a Jewish state and an Arab state that was then part of Jordan that was part of it. Two-state solution was also the situation from 1948 to 1967, in which the Palestinians lived as part of Jordan itself. Jordan did not stay out of the 67 war and therefore lost the territories in 1967. Two-state solution was suggested and came very close to an agreement, was the ideal that was presented at the with the Oslo Accords in 1993. It was also very close to an agreement in 2000 with Yasser Arafat, Bill Clinton, and Ehud Barak, and it was also suggested in 2008. There was a close to agreement, and there was about a 98% swap of land, return of land and swap of land. So the two-state solution has been on, and one of the ways of handling Gaza with that is to handle Gaza by creating as it were, a highway tunnel system that unites Gaza with the West Bank, that ends the isolation and separation of Gaza. So if there is a will and a desire, then there is a way. We have to end this, somebody has to end the situation in which Palestinians live in refugee camps.
Yes.
They've been living in a, quotation marks, temporary situation because they have been promised that they're going to return to their homes.
Yes.
They haven't been allowed to be absorbed into, participate fully, neither in Gaza nor in Lebanon nor in other places, in the societies in which they dwell, in which there is a commonality of religion and language, and living for 4 generations and sometimes 5 and 6 generations in refugee status is a horrific position.
Of course.
And I think that everybody that I know agrees that not only the world must participate in the rehabilitation of refugees, but Israel has a responsibility to participate in that, and in fact has indicated on multiple occasions that it's willing to do that.
Okay, understood. And now coming back to you on the same question, would you support or reject this ideology of Zionism?
Well, I don't out and out reject the idea of a Jewish state. Generally, I don't believe in states built on ethnicity or religion. But given the persecution that Jewish people have suffered throughout the millennia, it's possible that they could be an exception to that rule. That being said, while I don't out and out reject the Jewish state, or I don't out and out reject Zionism, I do reject the movement of large numbers of people to settle in a land and then to consequently ethnically displace the native people of that land. And so...
but that includes America, that includes Canada, that includes Australia, that includes Mexico, that includes 22 different countries. As long as you reject it across the board, then it's legitimate it's a legitimate position.
Yeah, so, well, the difference between America and Israel right now is that, well, we're not currently waging war on Native Americans. We're not currently...
But we did for a century. Jews feel an attachment to and a rootedness in and a history and a past and a religious attachment to the land of Israel. Jerusalem is central in prayers. We begin Rosh Hashanah, we end Yom Kippur, and we end Passover with next year in Jerusalem.
Yes.
It is suffused throughout the Bible, and it became the symbol of hope during 2,000 years of exile.
Right. So I'm actually consistent on this. If I was Andrew Jackson in the whenever he was president of the United States, I would not have ordered the Trail of Tears. I would not have ethnically displaced the Native Americans. So I'm actually consistent on this. I think the difference between the United States, I'm not especially familiar with Canada or Mexico, the difference between the United States and Israel is that, one, we're not waging war on Native Americans.
No, but we did,
Two,
though. That was the point.
We did, but we're not currently.
Current, okay,
So to make the analogy work, if Israel had waged a war of complete annihilation against the Palestinians, and they spread them out they murdered most of them, and they spread them out, the rest out to all corners of the world, at this point it wouldn't be reasonable to say that there should be a Palestinian state, because it would be completely impossible. So if the analogy was, if Israel was completely comparable to the United States, then there would be, 100 million or 50 or 100 million or 600 million Native Americans living in America, treated as second-class citizens, which is how the Palestinians are treated in Israel and in the West Bank, and they are being massacred in Gaza. And so the analogy between the displacement of Native... Let me just finish real quick. The analogy between the displacement of Native Americans and the displacement of Palestinians is not really apt, because the current living situation of Native Americans in America is not the same as the current living situations of Palestinians in Palestine.
Look, Israel's waging war in Gaza. First of all, it's waging war against Hamas. And the reason Israel's waging war is there was a ceasefire on October 6th. Ceasefire was violated on October 7th. You had the murder of 1,200 Israelis, which is the equivalent of 45,000 Americans. You have rockets being shot from Gaza at Israel. I can only imagine what the response might be in the United States if we had the murder of 45,000 Americans coming into us from Mexico. We had people who called an invasion of Mexico when people are trying to come to America for opportunity and for freedom and the ability to feed their children, and they called that an invasion. Imagine if 45,000 people were killed. Israel did not choose this war, and Israel did not also choose the circumstances of this war. And consequently, you can't say it's waging war without giving it a context of what created the wartime situation. Plus, I think we have to say something else, which is, I believe that the Palestinian population of Israel has to be better integrated into Israeli society. But if you look at some major institutions of Israel, there is a deeply successful integration of this population. The pharmacy industry is dominated by Arab Palestinian Israelis. In medical schools, you have a significant number of Palestinian Israelis who are physicians and who participate, and who ironically are people who are performing operations on both wounded Israelis and wounded people, Palestinians from Gaza. You have the largest religious university in Israel is also home to the largest population of Palestinian Arabs and Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel living in Israel. But I think that we have to distinguish, and all of the research indicates that the Palestinian Arab population of Israel wants to remain Israeli citizens. Israel withdrew from occupying Gaza in 2005. Gaza had the opportunity to become a model of coexistence with Israel, and by the way, also with Egypt. And instead, in 2007, it threw out the Palestinian Authority, and it welcomed Hamas. And Hamas has been unwilling to, in its charter and in its origins, unwilling to even consider the possibility of peace with Israel.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say there. First of all, I do reject the notion of comparing human lives in one country with human lives in another country based on proportionality. So 1,200 lives is terrible because it's 1,200 human beings that have been killed. Saying that that's 45,000 Americans doesn't really make sense to me. But you say imagine if 45,000 Americans were killed. It's not too hard to imagine that because 35,000 Gazans have been killed. And so we can see 35,000 lives being taken in Gaza over the last 8 months.
Let me say that I neither trust the military figures given by Israel of the number of Hamas fighters who have been killed, nor do I trust the figures coming out of the Gaza of the Gaza Health Services, which is a Hamas-run Gaza Health Services. So I don't know. I want to look. Loss of human life is horrific. I use 45,000 not as a comparison, just to give an American audience a sense of scope.
Yes.
Israel is essentially, the United States is 35 times the size of Israel, and the comparable number to 1,200 is approximately 45,000. It's not every human life, I believe, is sacred.
Yes.
And consequently, it's a matter of not comparing or saying it. It's giving the Americans an idea of what that represents and how much it does. We also know that from experiences to how the United States reacted when we had 2,900 people killed on 9/11. We went into 3 different wars.
Right. So then the natural reaction to that is, well, the equivalent in America of the amount of Gazans that have been killed would be around 6 million, because it's about 2% of the population. 2% of 300 million is 6 million. So if we're going to make these comparisons, fine, but then we have to acknowledge that it works on both sides. Now, the second thing I want to address is that you said that Israel is waging war against Hamas. Well, they're certainly waging war partially against Hamas, but as we've seen with, at the very least, at minimum, a 2 to 3 civilian, or a 2 to, a 3 to 1 civilian to militant ratio at being the most generous. This is not just a war against Hamas, it's a war against all Palestinian civilians. In fact, we saw at Pt.1 hospital in Gaza that the IDF soldiers, when they paraded around 70 men and boys around the hospital and stripped them and put them in a ditch. Many of them were civilians. Many of them were not militants, and they were identified afterwards as civilians. And we can also say that Gaza had the opportunity to coexist with Israel peacefully in 2005. Well, that's not really true, because as soon as Hamas was elected in 2006, Israel placed an embargo on them when a ceasefire was announced between the two.
Hamas was, let's go back. Hamas came in power 2007. But the other thing is, I give a simple example. James Wolfenson, who was then with the World Bank, if I remember correctly, raised funds to provide the Palestinian population with all the greenhouses that had been created by Israeli settlers. Paid for them, bought them, and provided that with the funds. The Palestinian population burned those greenhouses, which could have been a significant source of income. You have to understand that part of my disappointment in Palestinian leadership is because I think we need strong and good and state-minded Palestinian leadership in order to get out of this quagmire. You also have to say something else, which is, and you have to look at this, the Hamas has deliberately placed military supplies in and military personnel and dug tunnels in schools, in mosques, in hospitals, and even in United States, in United Nations or rescue and relief organization capacities. This is something that makes the type of fighting terrible. Now, by the way, if the ratio of dead is 3 to 1, you have to ask yourself, in the history of war, how does that compare? And what does it compare to in terms of the nature of civilian populations? We're dealing in a situation in which, for terrible reasons, civilians' populations have been put at risk by their own leadership. And I can tell you this, that anybody looking at what happened on October 7th would have predicted that there would be a strong and aggressive Israeli response. And frankly, the decision was made by Hamas leadership that they were willing to take that in order to achieve what goal that they wanted at that circumstances. But anybody looking at that could have predicted this is what was going to be the response.
Gaza had the opportunity, Hamas had the opportunity to exist peacefully with Israel. It would have been very hard for Hamas to exist peacefully with Israel when they had no hope of any sort of economic vitalization, because Israel, as soon as Hamas was elected, and as we all know, Israel and the United States allowed an election in Gaza because they didn't expect Hamas to win. They did. Immediately, Israel placed an embargo on Hamas, and it was actually Israel who broke the ceasefire with the extrajudicial killing of Abu Shabana, I believe his name is. And it was also Israel who violated the ceasefire by, instead of completely reneging on the embargo or taking away the embargo from Gaza, only softening it. And so it would have been very difficult for Hamas to peacefully coexist with Israel while they completely ceased firing rockets into Israel, and Israel was violating the terms of the ceasefire. Now, to move on to what you said about hospitals and safe zones and mosques and Hamas operating in them, I haven't seen evidence, clear evidence, that Hamas doesn't use mosques and hospitals. However, I also haven't seen clear evidence, certainly not from the IDF, that they do. And now the
I think you have to look at the evidence. There is clear and consistent evidence that this is done. And you have to be willing to face that, and you have to be willing to ask, why is this done, and what is the risk that Hamas has put its own civilian population
well, right. So
to?
So when I tried to find evidence for Hamas using civilian population centers as military bases, the evidence that I found, I looked at a NATO summary of war crimes committed by Hamas, the testimony was given primarily by Israeli sources, and then looking at any photographic evidence given by the IDF hasn't been sufficient enough. Now, I'm actually willing to entertain the idea, especially since I'm not a supporter of Hamas in any way, that Hamas does terrible things like using civilian population centers. What I'm saying is that I haven't seen evidence worthy enough for Israel to believe it to be proportional to bomb numerous hospital complexes. In fact, every hospital complex in Gaza is no longer fully functional, to bomb mosques, to bomb churches, and to bomb safe zones. And also, you have to acknowledge that, moral or not, whether you believe the war is moral or not, which I, of course, don't, it is a violation of international law to bomb a hospital, to bomb a mosque, to bomb a safe zone without full assured evidence that there is that is being used for military purposes, and beyond that, even if it is being used for military purposes, which, again, I don't think the evidence is clear enough for, then it is against international law to attack the safe zone of the hospital or any protected place without dropping leaflets beforehand, which is, by the way, the bare minimum. And Israel, the IDF, has numerous times, including in Tel El-Zatan and in Western Rafah, have failed to drop leaflets before attacking and killing civilians.
But let's begin. Number one, I'm a historian. I look at evidence, and I have no view that cannot be changed by evidence because I'm a strict empiricist. I can tell you that if you look at the evidence is compelling. I don't have it on me. If you give me a day, I can compile the evidence to show you this type of thing. That makes the type of battle that is being waged much more difficult to achieve, much more difficult to do, and much more risky to the civilian population. And that should have been anticipated and could have been anticipated and was anticipated by the leadership that began it that began the attack on October 7th. It's clear that they anticipated this response. It's probably even clear that they wanted that response because they felt that it could lead to a delegitimation of Israel, which is one of their political goals. Why did Israel in 2006, and let's look at that. In 2006, you have to look at the Hamas charter, which indicated not the death to Israel, but the death to Jews. It's been amended since to the death to being anti-Zionist instead of being anti-Jewish. But Israel had every right at that point to say, with this we cannot negotiate. Now, I have long felt that Israel has not paid sufficient enough, and the United States and the world has not, and the Arab world included, has not paid sufficient attention to the Palestinian issue and has not put sufficient pressure on both sides to come to an agreement. But at the moment at which you had the possibility of agreement, at that moment, the Palestinian leadership decided otherwise.
Gotcha.
Again, you have clear evidence. Oslo looked like it was going in a direction. When Bill Clinton sought to bring it to a conclusion in 2000, Arafat blinked and said, "I'd rather attack."
People at the encampment, at least at the University of California, Los Angeles, other places too, have used settler colonial language to describe Israel. Would you call Israel a settler colonial state or no?
Yeah, you can use the verbiage of Zionist writers, Zionist thinkers like Herzl and Jabotinsky, the two most important Zionist thinkers in terms of, and you can even look at just the definitions of settlement or colonialism. Colonization is defined as the movement of a people to settle a land, which undoubtedly has been done by Israel. So either way you look at it, whether you look at the most important Zionist thinkers of the early 1900s, or whether you look at the definition of settler colonialism, Israel is a settler colonialist state.
How would you describe Israel to be that in that case? You would say by the people who were promoting Zionism?
No, because Zionists in the from 1880 to say 1948 and beyond, it's defined by it aptly fits the definition of colonialism, in that it is a group of people who settle the land and colonize the land. So I don't think that's particularly controversial.
Would you define Israel as a settler colonial state or no?
No.
No.
I would point to a very, let's begin. Look, we have to distinguish between Herzl and Jabotinsky. Herzl had a vision for a political solution to it, and that is and Herzl had a certain naivete. The political solution was that the Jews would establish a political entity, a state that would lead to the normalization of the Jewish people, to an end to anti-Semitism and the like. He was willing to accept, and the Jewish people were not, he was willing to accept a territory in Uganda because he felt that that was immediately achievable, that was statehood. The Jewish people revolted against that, and even though it was passed after great difficulty by the Zionist Congress, it was rejected in practice. Jabotinsky had a view that in Hebrew it was Shtei Gedot LaYarden, Zu Shelanu, Zu Gam Kain. There are two sides of the Jordan. This is ours and that is ours. He had a maximalist approach. There are some who still support that maximalist approach, though nobody's advocating conquering Jordan at this point. There are elements of the Israeli government that support a maximalist approach, that want a one-state, Jewish state solution between the sea, the river, and the sea.
What's your justification for Israel not being a settler colonial state?
Let me go back. There was a famous dialogue between Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Buber. And Martin Buber was not in favor of a Jewish state, was in favor of a binational state. So Martin Buber was a one-state solution leader, and was probably the greatest Jewish theologian of the first half of the 20th century, the first two-thirds of the 20th century. The dialogue between them is that Buber said, no, this is not colonialism, because the definition of colonialism is that you settle a land in order to take its treasures and bring it back to the native countries. That was the way in which colonialism operated. And what the Israelis did was to settle the land, to create it as a home, to improve the land, to create a viable, wondrous economy, to create booming crops, to revitalize and rejuvenate the land. And that ironically benefited both the Jewish population and the native Palestinian population as well. So I don't regard Israel as a settlist colonial enterprise, though I do say there are segments of the Israeli population and of the Israeli government that are very comfortable with colonialism.
Well, there are a few things that need to be addressed there. First of all is that, Israel, of course, is not a settler colonial state in the same way that Britain was in the 1700s. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that by definition, they settled the land and they colonized the land if you simply look at the definition of settling and colonizing. Now you could say that they didn't in the same way as Britain did go to lands and take all the natural resources and deliver back to Britain. Well, no, but it would have been impossible for them to do so. Now, secondly, the way you describe the improvements of the lives of Palestinians as brought upon by Zionism is the same way that many European settler colonialist states legitimized and validated their imperialist and settler colonialist missions by saying that they were, quote, taming the savages. Which I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, but the legitimization of a settler colonialist project is the same. And now it would also be impossible to say that the lives of the people in Gaza are better than they were in the 1800s, or the lives of the people in the West Bank are better than they were in the 1800s. Even the Israeli Palestinians are treated as second-class citizens in Israel.
Well, let's go. First of all, almost all life is better than it was in the 1800s. And that is, let's take it in a very basic way. You take the elements of infant mortality, you take the elements of longevity. You also take the dramatic expansion of the population. And that is that if you take that 700,000 Palestinians were exiled in the Nakba, and you're now talking about a population of 5 million, they have increased and proliferated and brought children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren into the world. Why is Israel not a settler element? Number one, the Israelis regard Israel as their homeland and their country. I keep hearing from even deep opponents of the Israeli government say, Ein li haaretz acheret, I have no other place. This is my home. They came to live there, to dwell there, and remember, Jews never left the land of Israel. There were 5 cities in which Jews continued to dwell for millennia. Our roots are there. Our roots are biblical roots. They go back we trace our history to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham came to the land of Canaan. Moses brought a people out of the desert to the promised land. There was conquest in the time of Joshua. We trace our ancestry to people like David and Solomon, and it's a complex history, but it's a history that's deeply and profoundly attached to land, so it's not like we're without roots. I argue within the Jewish community that we have to deeply recognize the roots of the Palestinians in this land as well, and that's precisely the reason why I'm looking for a two-state solution. And ironically, you'd have to say that one of the peculiarities of this moment is that it appears to everybody the only rational but perhaps non-achievable solution is a two-state solution, precisely because the peoples cannot get along and consequently they cannot live together.
One thing I would like to ask both of you, by the way, I'll ask Aidan first. What are some things being said on your side that you disagree with or you think are inappropriate?
I didn't personally see anything in the encampment that I didn't agree with. I'm sure if somebody brought up a French example of something that happened in the encampment, then I would disagree with it. There are certainly a lot of people on social media who identify as far right and who are also anti-Israel. I'd say more anti-Israel than pro-Palestinian because their beliefs are largely founded by anti-Semitism. I don't agree with any of them. I don't believe that, and this again is a fringe view, especially when you consider the encampment and college students being pro-Palestinian. But it is a view that exists marginally on the Palestinian side that Jews control the world and that Jews are trying to destroy the white race, none of which I agree with. In fact, I strongly disavow those views. But the majority of the pro-Palestinian movement, I strongly agree with.
Is there anything you would say on the Israeli side that you would disagree with?
I've absolutely been deeply critical of the Israeli government. I continue to be deeply critical of the Israeli government. I've known the Prime Minister of Israel for well past 40 some odd years. I've disagreed with him politically for well past 40 some odd years, and I've held high positions in the Jewish community throughout advocating a two-state solution, even before its two-state solution became a viable option after Oslo. So there are many things that I object to in the Israeli government. I would at this point believe that President Biden has offered the best option for coming out of this war with some gains for both sides.
Yes.
So I do actually have a question for you, though, on what you said earlier. I agree that the best argument against Israel being a settler colonial state is that Israel is the homeland for the Jewish people. I still don't agree, but I think that's the best argument against it. But then, would you acknowledge that that argument is weakened by the fact that so many immigrants to Israel from Europe were descended from converts? Or do you disagree with that statement in and of itself? I mean, David Ben-Gurion is believed to have been descended from, is not believed to have descended from the Canaanites. Or does that not matter?
No, let's go. There are two ways of becoming Jewish. One is to be born a Jew. The other is to make the decision to become part of the Jewish people. To make the decision to become part of the Jewish people, you have to repeat what the biblical Ruth said. Biblical Ruth said, "Your God shall be my God, your people shall be my people." That's the basic element. Conversion then makes you a full-fledged member of the Jewish people. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, that the accusation that Judaism is racism doesn't work, because we are a multiracial people that accept converts. When I worked down south in the civil rights movement, no black could say, "I want to become white," and be accepted, quotation marks, in the white community. Segregation was deep, and the like. Having said that, it is clear that Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people. It's built into the DNA of Judaism. David Ben-Gurion himself has his roots. We know his ancestors. We know at least back for 4 generations David Ben-Gurion was part of the Russian Jewish community, and he was part essentially, there was a tremendous migration from Russia because Jews could not live there. Most of the people came to the United States between 1881 and 1924, when American immigration regulation changed. A smaller group, a far more ideologically determined group, went to Israel. They were essentially the early Zionists, and they came to develop the land and to settle the land, and they came to stay. I don't know of any evidence whatsoever that Ben-Gurion himself comes from a family of converts at all, but that wouldn't matter. The moment you convert, and look, I just spoke to a conversion class, and I asked a conversion class of people, I said, we have a tradition in Jewish life that we do not automatically welcome the convert. We have to say to the convert several things. In Orthodox tradition, you must 3 times reject the convert, and only after the 4th time may you and should you welcome the convert. But we have to say to the convert, do you understand that you are going from a majority status to a minority status? And do you understand that this poses a risk not only for you, but for you and your children and your grandchildren? And as long as you understand that and you're willing to say what Ruth said, your people are my people, your God is my God, then we welcome the convert, and thereafter we are not to refer to the convert as a convert. In fact, we call them, in a very nice term in the United States, Jews by choice. They're Jews by birth and Jews by choice.
Understood. Okay. Another thing I would like to move on to. One definition of hate speech is any form of expression through which through speakers intend to vilify, humiliate, or incite hatred against a group of or class of peoples on the basis of race, religion, skin color, sexual identity/orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, disability, or national origin. Hate speech is generally protected by the First Amendment in the United States unless it constitutes a threat or incitement against a group. Universities have an obligation to create a safe, inclusive learning environment for all members of the campus community. Are using symbols on campus, such as swastikas or stepping on Jewish stars, an appropriate expression of free speech, or are they a threat or incitement against Jews? To you, Aidan?
Well, certainly swastikas are an incitement against Jews. Stepping on the Star of David, I could also is easily classifiable as a incitement against Jews, but neither should be banned. UCLA is a public is a public school, and therefore the public speech laws should apply to UCLA. And if you are such a despicable person that you want to fly a swastika, you should be able to. Just like if you want to say that Gaza should be nuked, you should be able to say that. Doesn't mean that you're right, doesn't mean that anybody agrees with that, but it's just, that's an American principle that I'm not going to go back on.
Would you say that is an incitement of violence against Jews, or no, or a threat against them? At least those on the UCLA community.
Well, somebody who's waving around a swastika is probably also inciting violence against Jews. I don't really, I mean, maybe, Michael, you could explain to me how this is the case. I don't see how waving a swastika, as awful as it is a direct call for violence, if that's what you're alleging. I think a swastika, just like any other, just like I think a Confederate flag, just like I think really any expression of free speech should be protected, as despicable, as disgusting as we find it.
Michael, to you, just like saying, are using symbols on campus such as swastikas or stepping on Jewish stars, such as the Star of David, appropriate expressions of free speech, or are they a threat or incitement against Jews?
You are deliberately being provocative. Whether you're then saying, I don't want to push for violence, you're deliberately being provocative. Under the swastika, millions of Jews were murdered, and when Jews find that profoundly, deeply, existentially offensive, and emotionally, like putting a bull in a red cape in front of bull, I understand that. I think it's an incitement. Whether it's an incitement to violence, depends, and I hate to use this because those bloody presidents of the university used it, depends on its context, but it certainly is meant as hate speech, except, by the way, if you go back to India, where the swastika is not a Nazi symbol, right? If the swastika is not a Nazi symbol, it's not a negative symbol. But if you use it in the West, you mean it as a Nazi symbol. And the reason I say that is because I've been working. I worked on a book that dealt with Indian art, and the question became whether we put or do not put the swastika in it as it was there. So in that context, it is not hate speech. In any other context in the West, at a demonstration at UCLA, it is meant to be provocative. It is using, red, putting red in front of the, It is permissible, but it's profoundly, deeply, and totally offensive.
Unfortunately, it may be possible at some point that America gets to a place where the public, and again, as a public, we rightfully condemn the swastika generally, but it may come to a place where America says, well, the pride flag is hate speech, and the swastika is actually a great thing. Hopefully, in that scenario, we'd still be able to maintain our values of free speech and allow the pride flag to be waved, and hope that the American public, which again is how we view these things, it's all based on the public consensus. Which can sway and which can be, like we saw in Nazi Germany, become supportive of terrible things. It's important that we maintain these principles so that if the public consensus is ever in support of something awful, then the quote-unquote right things will still be allowed to, the right flags will still be allowed to be flown, and the right mantras, the right slogan, the right sayings will still be allowed to be said. So it's important that we maintain these principles, even in the face of such horrible things like a swastika and hate speech.
Since having swastikas or stepping on Stars of David, would we say that is a direct incitement against Jews? Because since in that case, that is against the First Amendment in inciting violence. We can have free speech.
You mean incitement to violence?
Incitement
in that case, no.
You would say it's not?
No.
But you would not say it's not?
If you can interpret the swastika as an incitement to violence, then that's just a slippery slope. You can interpret it, a lot of things, as an incitement to violence, which would lead to the violation of people's right to free speech.
Look, the classic example of restricted speech becomes to the question of you can't say fire in a crowded theater. And then it all depends on what you're doing, what the context is.
Exactly. If you're waving a swastika around and saying, and you're trying to start a riot, then that is an incitement to violence.
And, if you come into a synagogue carrying a swastika, you shouldn't be surprised if somebody throws you the hell out.
Or even physically attacks you. That's probably justified if you carry a swastika into a synagogue.
And by the way, and that's the difference between a university. Let's go back to a university which is especially a public university, which is a public institution. Remember, the First Amendment applies to government restrictions on speech. It does not apply to other types of things. It applies to the government may not censor your speech. If I don't want to include your essay in my book, I have every right not to include your essay in my book. So we have to understand what the limits of free speech are. It means the government cannot come down against your ability to express yourself.
So it sounds like we're generally in agreement on this.
Yeah, no, I mean Daniel Patrick Moynihan always said that everybody's entitled to their opinion, but not to their set of facts.
Yeah.
Of course. But then in that way, then would you say that having Jewish students not being comfortable walking to class through the encampment area with people brandishing traditionally anti-Semitic slogans and words, because would you say that's not incitement?
No, I don't think that's an incitement to violence. And the reason I don't think that is because, well, first of all, let's look at it logically. And I don't believe in tokenism. But if we're just looking at the reality of the situation, there were Jewish people in the encampment that felt perfectly safe and perfectly fine being in the encampment. If Jewish students felt uncomfortable, then it wasn't because they were Jewish, it was because they had an unreasonable and really unjustified expectation that somebody is going to attack them, which, you know, didn't happen, at least not from any student at UCLA in the encampment. Now, you could also make the same argument, was it reasonable for the people in the encampment to feel unsafe when they were attacked by a violent, angry mob of counter-protesters? Is that Palestine-phobic? You know, I think you could ask the question both ways.
But let's look at it one other way. Look, one of the clear definitions of anti-Semitism is to hold individual Jews responsible for actions of other Jews. And if you're calling out somebody, for example, who wears a kippah, who wears a yarmulke on their head, and you're blaming him for the war in Gaza, that's an anti-Semitic act.
Which I agree with.
Whether it's permissible or not, it's an anti-Semitic act. If somebody feels that that is what's being directed against them because they're Jewish, that's creating an atmosphere which may not be violent, but it certainly is not conducive to a university education.
And if it reaches a level of harassment, then...
And it reaches the level of harassment, it should be stopped.
And prosecutable.
And you would say it has not reached that point, at least at the University of California, Los Angeles?
Well, not to like a meaningful extent. Like, it hasn't been on a systemic level. Certainly not at UCLA.
But you would say that that does go against UCLA trying to create a safe, inclusive learning environment.
If students are harassing other students, yeah. But that's an individual case on an individual basis. And so the encampment, there's nowhere in their policies to say that you should be harassing students with yarmulkes on. And that you could say that's irrelevant because, well, it doesn't need to be in their policies for it to happen on a systemic level. That's true, but it didn't happen on a systemic level. And the atmosphere of the encampment was generally inviting and generally welcoming to anybody of any skin color, of any religion, as long as you agreed with the movement.
But then that's the point. Then you're saying agree with the movement. I should still be allowed to go through without having harassment or freedom of movement, which was restricted. Would you not say that?
Well, if you're going to the encampment and you're waving around an Israeli flag, well, you could also say that, you could equally argue that that's harassment of people in the encampment. So I don't really think that argument holds up.
Look, I have no direct experience in the encampment, so I can't speak, but I can say that the students should feel that they can get to their classes, their way to their classes should not be blocked, and they could get to their classes freely. That's the job of the administration to support that. If somebody walks into the middle of the encampment and screams at them, and there's some opposition to that, that's clearly not something the university has to respect. I don't have the right to walk into the encampment and challenge anybody, et cetera, and then say, but I wasn't treated safely, as it were.
Right.
No right to violence. No, you have a right not to be attacked and violence. But if I yell and somebody yells back at me, that's fine. That's perfect.
And ultimately, the most important thing is if the encampment was restricting people's right to free movement, and I'm not saying that they were, and if they were breaking the law, and again, I'm not saying that they were, but ultimately the most important factor in this conversation is breaking the law, and again, not an admission of guilt, is breaking the law worthy of the cause that the encampment is protesting against, which is the genocide in Gaza. And I think it's plain, it's obvious to anybody who looks at the facts that what the encampment was tame in comparison to what they're protesting against.
So let's go back to two things that you said, because I want to take issue with both, and it's very important. The first issue is very simply, I have a good deal of experience in nonviolent protests. I have a reasonably good arrest record for participating in nonviolent protests. I was a child of the 60s in which we did this morning, evening, and night. And I had a classmate by the name of Andrew Goodman of blessed memory, who was one of the 3 people who was killed in Mississippi registering voters. So we were taught throughout that if we were arrested, that was the price to pay for nonviolent protest. And that is that, and remember, in our era, nonviolent protest meant that you went to a restaurant with an African American and you sat at a lunch counter that was subject to arrest. So the reality is, if you are protesting and you break the law, you can challenge the nature of the law and you can have the reason for protest, and you have to believe the cause for which you're protesting is worth it. I challenge the notion that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. I think I know a little bit about genocide. I've written a considerable amount about genocide. You can accuse Israel of many things. One of the issues that you cannot accuse Israel of is committing genocide in that situation. I think anybody who knows it, and we'll see what happens in the international court and the like, either both sides are committing genocide or neither side is committing genocide, but that's not the definition of genocide. There's one obscure provision of the Genocide Convention, which is the only basis upon which one can deal with that, and one has to know the history of that provision in order to make it. Genocide is the elimination of a people in whole or in part. And the reason it was in part is because the Nazis had the final solution to the Jewish problem, which was the elimination of the entirety of the Jewish people. And during the Armenian genocide, which is the basis upon which Raphael Lemkin developed the law, there were Armenians who were safe, for example, if they lived in Istanbul, and the Armenians in other areas were systematically murdered. Now, the crucial mistake in the language of the Genocide Convention is it uses in whole or in part without definition, defining what part we're talking about. Is it one person? Is it two people? Is it 1,000 people? Is it 10,000 people? Or is it in the Armenian case where it was in excess of 1 million people? But Israel is, and by the way, the best evidence that Israel has not committed genocide, and I can say it explicitly, Israel has the capacity to commit genocide. It has the incitement to commit genocide. It would stand to benefit by committing genocide because then it could have a land independently of its population. What it's doing is not committing genocide. That's the reason why we're ultimately going to go to a separation and to some sort of two-state solution, is because both people are living in the land. And the best evidence of that is numerical, which is if Israel was committing genocide, you would never have this expansion of the Palestinian population.